I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Later, we'll hear from Maggie Haberman about her just-released book. Trump book is called Confidence Man. But first, the war in Russia drags on. Russia appears to be losing ground to the Ukrainian army. Adding to the tension are recent nuclear threats by President Putin. He's threatened to use small nuclear weapons on his enemy. How long will the war go on, and is this threat to be taken seriously? Joining us now, Anton Troianovski, the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times. He's on Zoom from Berlin. Anton, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I grew up worrying about the space race, about the missile gap, and since then we had the Soviet Union lose a war in Afghanistan for all intents and purposes, now in effect being beaten or in a stalemate in the Ukraine. Is this all what President Eisenhower talked about as the military-industrial complex? Did we exaggerate the threat of Russia, or is this Putin fighting with one arm tied behind his back?
Well, the war is very much not over. You're right. Russia has suffered defeat after defeat on the front line over the last month. They've lost ground in the northeast, in the east, and in the south of Ukraine. But Putin is not really showing any indication of giving up. Instead, he has declared a draft. He's now forcing young men and not so young men in Russia to go and fight. And as you said, he's increasingly posturing with that nuclear arsenal, dropping ever more obvious hints that if Russia can't win this war in a conventional manner, that it would not rule out using nuclear weapons.
When I'm reading a book called The Story of Russia, which is an engaging history of the country, and it points out that in 1780, Tsar Nicholas mobilized 400,000 troops in 2 weeks. Now, you also, of course, look at the Russian Revolution when continuing the war against Germany was the downfall of the Kerensky government. Is the draft so unpopular in Russia now that it could mean the downfall of Putin?
Well, the downfall of Putin, I think that's really too early to speculate on. He clearly postponed this decision on implementing a draft for months because of the threat of domestic backlash. And he finally went ahead with it on September the 21st after those really humiliating defeats in the northeast of Ukraine. And what we've seen since then is, number one, a huge crush of men trying to get out of Russia. Putin did not close the borders. He actually allowed people to leave, I think in a way, using that as a way, as a safety valve, an escape valve, so to speak, of the domestic pressure. So the people who have stayed behind are the people who either don't have the means to leave or are prepared to some degree to go and fight, even if they don't necessarily know what they're getting themselves into. So we have seen a fair amount of discontent. We've seen a lot of reporting that's been circulating on Russian social media about the logistical problems with the draft, people not having anywhere to sleep, not getting proper uniforms or even food. But what we are not seeing is anything like what you mentioned about the Russian Revolution, any kind of mass discontent that is morphing into any kind of mass protest movement. That is not happening yet.
I don't want to sound facetious about it, but what is the threshold for using nuclear weapons? Aren't nuclear weapons simply bigger bombs than conventional weapons? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, obviously, nuclear weapons have not been used in war since 1945, since the U.S. dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for Putin, the fact that Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal is in itself a card that lends Russia global power and influence, but it really only works as long as he doesn't actually have to use that nuclear arsenal. Because as soon as he does, that really opens a huge Pandora's box. Nuclear bombs, even so-called low-yield nuclear weapons, are still incredibly destructive, lead to radiation and really various other unpredictable physical consequences. And of course, also would really hurt Russia on the world stage in terms of its image. For the moment, Russia is still really trying to maintain the neutrality of countries like India, China, countries in Africa and Latin America. So far, it's really just the West that is putting all these sanctions on Russia. And I think there is a widespread expectation that were Putin to escalate to using these horrific weapons, he would really risk losing China and India and other key partners.
Is this a no-win for Putin, or is there still a way out for him?
Great question. That's frankly the million-dollar question right now, I think, because it's really hard to game this out and see how, frankly, how this ends for either side. While Russia is losing on the front line right now, they will, through this mobilization, get a new reserve of personnel that they can send to the front, that they'll be able to arm in some manner. And they may well be able to resume their offensive at some point. On the other side, you also don't see Putin really being able to make a deal here that would be acceptable for the Ukrainians. And the key thing that happened last week is the annexation by Putin of 4 regions of eastern Ukraine. He went and declared that these 4 regions of eastern Ukraine that Russia doesn't even fully control are now part of Russia. And so by that, he's saying this will be part of Russia forever. It's now non-negotiable. I've taken this territory. So it's becoming really harder by the day to see how Putin can get out of this.
Tell us briefly, if you would, how it is as a reporter for an American publication to cover a Russian war against Ukraine.
Well, first of all, as you know, we at the New York Times have really put enormous resources into covering this. We have multiple teams of reporters and photographers on the ground in Ukraine. We have our network of bureaus across Europe, including here in Berlin. That's really a key part of the coverage. We also have our Moscow bureau still, and that has been indeed very challenging to find a way to cover the war from Russia, in large part because Russia has actually passed laws that criminalize independent reporting about the war. And so that's a reason why we and many other Western news outlets really radically reduced their presence on the ground in Russia. But we are resuming our on-the-ground reporting. My colleague Valerie Hopkins was in Russia recently and filed some really fascinating and beautifully illustrated reports from Moscow and also from Belgorod on the border with Ukraine. So I would really encourage viewers to go back and read those reports if they haven't already. But it is very challenging.
Very quickly, are those reports from Russia censored?
No, absolutely not. No, we would never agree to any kind of government censorship.
Thanks to Anton Troianovski, Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times, for joining us. Coming up next, the Times' Maggie Haberman and Confidence Man. Welcome back. Last week on the New York Times Close-Up, Peter Baker of the Times gave us an unprecedented inside look at 4 years of the Donald Trump presidential administration. Today's guest takes a long look at Donald Trump himself, digging deep into his New York years as a real estate mogul, his long relationship with the media, painting a riveting picture of the man who would be one day, improbably, the president. Maggie Haberman is a White House correspondent who still writes about the former president. Her new book, Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America. It came out this week. And Maggie, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Sean Willits in the Washington Post said that none of Donald Trump would have been possible but for a social, cultural, political, media, and moral breakdown that overtook New York beginning in the 1970s. Now, depending on your point of view, do New Yorkers really deserve the blame or credit for Donald Trump?
I think, Sam, first of all, thanks for having me. And it's great to be here with you. But 100%, yes, this is the milieu from which he hails. He excelled at capitalizing on other people's misery. His rise came during the 1970s when New York City, as you know well, was on the brink of fiscal disaster. And he used that to his advantage to get projects that were advantageous to him, less advantageous to the state and the city in terms of giveaways, according to the critics of them. And he, brick by brick, using the New York media, built this artifice about himself as a tycoon, commensurate with sort of older New York real estate folks who just did not view him that way. But outside of New York City, because he was getting so much press, he was seen as something he just wasn't. He was seen as synonymous with wealth and success. And so simultaneously in New York, he was absorbing New York's racial tribal politics. He was absorbing lessons about its machine boss party politics. And he ultimately exported all of that to Washington once he finally ran for office and won.
How did we let him get away with that, or was it mutually beneficial? And what lessons should we learn or should we have learned in case he runs for president again?
So I would say a couple of things, Sam. Number one, at this point, for all of his myth making about the size of his wealth and the size of his success and his actual profile and portfolio, there is significance to him now in a way there wasn't before, because now he has a significant chunk of the Republican Party behind him, and if not behind him, afraid of him. And so those are real keys that didn't exist previously, number one. But number two, in terms of letting him get away with it, I think that there were a number of people in the media, in investigative capacities, in politics, who in society, who let him get. Wealthy society, who let him, enabled him over the course of a really long period of time. One of the things that I track in the book is how long he has been honing this playbook of cultivating prosecutors and trying to sort of have these private discussions with them and trying to charm them and woo them. The first time he was investigated by a prosecutor, now the DOJ sued his company in 1973, but in the late 70s, he was investigated by Ed Corman, who then was the Brooklyn federal prosecutor. That was the first time that he faces that kind of investigation. And he dealt with it, and Wayne Barrett documented this in his book, dealt with it by, trying to sell the investigators that nothing was wrong. They ultimately had a weak witness, and it was a brief investigation, but Trump used that as a real template for how to move forward with investigations. He ended up befriending Bob Morgenthau, the Manhattan district attorney, who took a trip to Mar-a-Lago and let Trump host a fundraiser for him in 2005. All of this adds up, Sam, and ends up getting us to 2015 when Trump is a candidate.
In Confidence Man, Joe Klein reviewed it for the New York Times and said that he remained an outer borough brat, intimidated by elites. Now, there are other people who you could sort of throw in that category, except maybe not the brat part. Mario Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo also had this chip on their shoulders from being from Queens, feeling resentful of the Manhattan elites. What was different about Donald Trump?
A couple of things, and some of this will be the same, at least in terms of the Cuomos and in terms of Andrew Cuomo, not Mario. But Donald Trump was a child of privilege. Donald Trump grew up the son of a wealthy man who believed that the system was always going to be rigged for him, and that indeed systems should not apply to him, and he should have a glide path. And he refused to accept anyone else's version of reality. Andrew Cuomo, when he was losing in 2002. As a candidate for governor, accepted that he was losing. and then he went off and he spent several years trying to become a candidate again. Now he benefited from his father's connections as well, and that is there's a long tradition of that in New York, but it is just fundamentally different because Trump both resented elites and wanted their approval, and this push-pull has defined a lot of his behavior over the years.
Joe Klein, in his review summing up your book, Confidence Man, said Trump wasn't just grotesque, a lucky nincompoop, but a genius. Now, was he really a genius? And also, was what he said over the 4 years of his presidency, before and beyond, a matter of delusion, or was it lies?
I think sometimes it's very hard to tell, Sam. One of the things that he is a believer in is repetition. He actually even said that to me in one of our interviews. And if you know you are using repetition, there is a cognition there, right? That you know that you are doing something. So that becomes less delusionary. But I think it is I think it's impossible to know, for instance, does he believe he really won the election? And I'm not sure it matters, Sam. What he's saying is so corrosive in terms of people's confidence in elections that whether he really believes it or not is sort of an afterthought. In terms of the genius piece, I think two things. I think he is shrewder than people realize, and he is more calculating moment to moment than people realize. He is not strategic. He is not capable of long-term planning, but he is quite calculating, and I try to show that throughout the book.
I think you do that very well. And Frank Bruni pointed out in the New York Times that perhaps the most revealing aspect of the book is that after all you wrote about him in the Times, and after all he said about you, he granted you 3 interviews for the book. How do we explain that?
Because he is constantly seeking the media's gaze. He is uniquely focused on the New York Times. I just happen to be the person who covered him more than most. And he, will take attention wherever he can get it. Now, he's not the first politician that I've ever covered who has this attention compulsion, but he is the first politician I've ever covered who has this media compulsion this way. It's just something fundamentally different.
In terms of the documents that he took to Mar-a-Lago, why did he take them? And is this a substantive problem? What was in them? Why did he want them?
So what we've learned about them over the course of the last several months is that there were more than 300 individual documents with classified markings. They left the White House with him. They arrived at some point at Mar-a-Lago. It's not clear whether it was all together or in separate tranches. His motivation, Sam, he could be anything from wanting trophies, which he likes, to simply believing everything is his. This is a person who referred to U.S. generals as my generals, as if they were set pieces. And a lot of things with him come down to leverage, and if he thought he was getting leverage somehow from this.
But is there any national security threat, or are these just, technicalities and bureaucracy?
Well, it's definitely not technicalities and bureaucracy, because a bunch of these documents had been identified as material that were presidential records and needed to be given to the National Archives, even before he left office. So this is not a technicality. Why he took them and was hanging on to them is a huge open question. He keeps saying things that are not true, that the General Services Administration, which is basically the custodians of the government, that they packed the boxes. That's not true. There's a lot still left to learn here, and the federal government is doing a damage assessment to figure out just how significant these documents were and any risk that came to the nation. But this is not a light matter.
What happened January 6th? What happened in Georgia? How liable do we think Trump is legally for any of that?
That's a great question. One of the things that his advisors have warned him is that he is facing civil liability, certainly related to January 6th, from people who file suits related to the violence that took place. Georgia, that is a criminal investigation, and it remains to be seen what happens there. But he is facing, significant legal jeopardy in a way he just never has before.
Is he going to run again?
I think he's backed himself into a corner where he has to. I think that he ceases to be relevant the same way if he doesn't run. He ceases to raise money the same way if he doesn't run. He needs the protections that running for office gives him and winning office potentially give him from investigations. I don't think his heart is in it the way it once was. Now, maybe that will change if he becomes a candidate. But he doesn't seem to enjoy the rallies the way he once did. And that's not surprising. To go from being a president to still having to sell yourself at rallies this way, I think for a lot of former presidents would be jarring.
Do you think he was surprised that he won the last time?
Yes, I do.
And
I do.
do you think he will win the next time?
I have no idea.
That's
I have decided my predictions are worth the paper they're written on.
I know that feeling. Why weren't there more heroes in the White House? We've read a lot, Peter Baker's book, other books, saying that there were people who tried to exercise some restraint on him, said, whether it was rationalization or not, better stay there than quit, so they could have a calming influence on Trump. But why weren't there more profiles in courage, arguably? People who got up and said, enough, we've had it, we're going to quit, and go public and say, this guy is a no-goodnik.
I think there were people who did it. I think I look at it slightly differently now, Sam, than I think I used to. I think that the people who were there did stop a lot of things. I think John Kelly in particular stopped a lot of things. I think Jim Mattis, the former defense secretary, slowed a lot of things. I think there's a different conversation to be had about the wisdom of putting retired military officers in political posts. I think that in terms of civilian military relations, that raises open questions, but that's a different topic. I don't know what difference people think it would have made. He was elected by the public, and it's become pretty clear over time that there is a significant chunk of the electorate that is not going to believe anything that they hear about him. So I don't know what difference it would have made unless the entire government decided to stop working, or if people were willing to invoke the 25th Amendment, which, Mark Esper, the final Senate confirmed defense secretary, wrote in his own book that, he never thought that Trump met that bar, for what the 25th Amendment actually is. The 25th Amendment doesn't exist for person, making policy that people think is crazy or behaving in erratic ways. It's a real incapacity that it applies to. So there is no mechanism for dealing with any of this. And I think people throwing up their hands wasn't the answer, because what we saw, Sam, in the final year with 2020 and the staff that he had there, it really did matter that there were other people there stopping things. What he was trying to do in those final months with the staff he had was problematic. And for all the attacks that Bill Barr has gotten, and people take legitimate issue with him on a range of topics, but he was slowing certain things down in 2020.
Speaking of crazy, explain to us Rudy Giuliani.
I was wondering when we were going to come back home. I can't. I mean, I think that Giuliani has always been a version of this, and I think it's just gotten worse and devolved over time. I think he's never been the same since he lost the presidential election in 2008. And I think that I think it's worth remembering. I think that having lived in this city all my life and having been down in Lower Manhattan on 9/11, I think that Giuliani comported himself really well the day of the attack and the few days after, and I think was very calming to a lot of people. And then a very short time later, he started talking about extending his time in office, which is undemocratic. And I think people lose sight of what a precursor that was to some of what we saw with Trump.
Thanks to Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. Her book is Confidence Man. And coming up next, I'll have some thoughts on Eric Adams. As the leading candidate for mayor last year, Eric Adams made a promise. I am the face of the new Democratic Party, he declared. I'm going to show America how to run a city. After 9 months as mayor, his face is familiar. Elections since then may even reflect the Democratic Party's latest ideological trajectory. But as New York's mayor, Adams has yet to show America how to run a city. So far, if he has alluded to an agenda of governing, he has not specified how he will fulfill it. Now, you might argue, give the guy a break. He's only been mayor for 9 months. Look at what he inherited from his predecessor. And the gargantuan challenges wreaked by the pandemic, its impact on tourism, job losses, how and where people work, and inflation. Still, as my astute colleague Jeffrey Mays observed, Adams seems to be running City Hall as if he were still Brooklyn Borough president. Now the Times reports that a think tank of civic leaders, led by Dick Ravitch and Tom Allen, is drafting what it hopes is a realistic policy agenda for the mayor. The Five Borough Institute wants to focus on child care for economic development, training and recruiting teachers, access to mental health services, while quietly and gingerly improving stop and frisk to prevent crime. No one said being mayor was going to be easy, but if Adams is going to show America how to run a city, he needs to start somewhere soon, and to show more than his own face. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.